Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to dewhvactrainingsc.com to inquire.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we talk about culture, history, society, and now political economy in this snowy land that we call Canada. We have a special guest today with us, who is a political economist and senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Previously, he has managed Toronto's poverty reduction strategy and taught at universities in both Ontario and Quebec. His early academic work focused on economic development and participatory democracy in his native country of Brazil, and his current research is on the political economy of social policy in Canada. He holds a PhD from the University of Waterloo, where he was a Vanier Scholar, and here to talk about his latest book called The Tenant Class, I'm happy to have on the show Ricardo Tranjan. Welcome to Historia Canadiana.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
So getting right into the meat of the topic in this case. So like I said, we're here to talk about your new book, which is coming out in 2023, The Tenant Class. Can you describe your book for listeners who might not be aware of what it's about or what you're trying to?
Of course, it is a short book that presents an alternative perspective to the housing crisis. In fact, it argues that there is no housing crisis. It argues that what we have presently is a housing market that allows certain segments of society to profiteer, and accumulate wealth, whereas a different sector, a smaller segment of society, namely those who need rental house, are charged quite a bit for housing and have difficulty building housing security. So it's not necessarily a crisis, but it's more a system that is set up to allow some to accumulate wealth at the detriment of others. And it also makes a point about focusing less on technical solutions to the so-called housing crisis and putting more emphasis on the political classes struggle. And then it goes a little bit into some case studies of past and present tenant organizing that kind of embodies that very clear notion that what we need is a political response. What we need is power in order to address this situation.
Very interesting. And we're going to get into specific questions as to all of those things that you raised in this case, but I want to continue a bit on a bit of the broader aspects of your book in this case, and you focus particularly on the situation here in Canada. But, if you listen to the media for, any amount of time, this idea of the housing crisis really comes out across the world. You see it talked about in the United States, in Europe, pretty much everywhere. And I'm curious what is particular about the situation here in Canada that makes this specific approach interesting to you, or why you decided to focus on Canada in particular for this book.
Yes, it was less about what's specific about Canada, because I think there are a lot of the things that are discussed and inscribed on the book that are applicable to other countries as well. It was more part of the project. This project was to provide a short, accessible reframing of the problem for the people who are actively engaged and discussing it here in Canada. And I draw a lot on my own experience as a researcher, as a policy person, and on the experience of organizers on the ground in various cities in Canada. So I think the focus has to do less with the particularity of the case and more with who the book is for.
That's a question I had later, but I guess we can get to it now in this case. Reading the book, at least, and I don't know if that was the particular intention here, but reading the book, I felt like it had more of a manifesto-like quality than it actually had, like you would expect from someone with an academic background like yourself, right? A more research-oriented or academic quality to it, which is not to say that what you advance isn't profound. Obviously, it is in many cases, but the writing style is very different. So I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit more about that particular writing style that you took. Was it purely just to be more accessible to a more general audience, or was there a bit more thought behind?
It was deliberate, and it was what the project intended, to provide a tool, to provide resource to especially to tenant and tenant organizers, but also to other folks who are active in the field, and to do so by clearly picking a side on debate and advancing an argument, as you mentioned, with all the empirical backing that it requires, but mostly concerned about it being a compelling and sort of enthusing argument and narrative to counter the very dominant narrative that we have right now around the crisis and technical problems and scarcity and all of that. So it was a very deliberate choice of how we decided to go forward with this project, and also I think in the manifesto like quality also has to do with the fact that the book is less about uncovering some empirical reality that is not known. It is less about providing new conceptual tools to understanding the crisis, and in a way it has a much simpler objective, which is just to turn the light on a different reality and a different perspective that already exists. And I joke about this sometimes, that one of my biggest fears in writing the book was that for tenant organizing, the analysis would be quite dull. They would read it and they would go like, no, duh, like, yeah, that's our life. Thanks for writing it. And so I think that it has that has influenced the format as well, where I'm just like, here's another reality. Let's pay attention to this. And it's there, it exists, it's lived. And so I think that also added to it being less about uncovering and more about describing and making sure, of course, to describe it in a compelling and in an interesting way.
Yeah. Another way that we can think about this, right? Because I read this as someone who is a tenant, right? And I have a generally good, understanding with my landlord, right? So, but I think I approached your book less with a sense of, oh, well, I didn't know that abuse had happened and that there was this system behind it, and more as a way of providing tools and a better way of understanding and framing, right, the arguments which do affect a great many people in Canada and elsewhere. So I think it's useful no matter where you situate yourself in this case. So yeah, I think in that sense it was very successful. I think your fears can be assuaged in that sense. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and my way of addressing the reluctance or in ensuring that the book would be useful is I consulted tenant and tenant organizers throughout the process. Actually, that's how the book was born. I had a 2-page research proposal, and I circulated to tenant organizers in 6 or 7 different Canadian cities, folks that I know more or less well, and I asked them, would this be useful And then I got on the phone with a bunch of them. I met some of them in person, and they were very enthusiastic about it. And they said, yeah, no, this will be useful. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go and write then. And I think that's part of the story, and perhaps part of the reason why I think someone like you would find it as a useful tool. I think it has to do with the fact that I consulted folks who are actually doing this work and who are living this reality, and they provided very valuable.
So getting into the heart of your book and your argument in this, I think it's perhaps best to begin with your main argument that you started off, right, when you were talking about the summary of the book, right, where you argue that the housing crisis isn't much of a crisis, right? And you can instead think of it as the system pretty much working exactly as it was supposed to. So can you talk a little bit about what that entails, like why you make this argument, and what impact does that have on how we might approach the world around?
The main motivation for making that argument is to change the conversation about the potential solutions to the crisis, to the so-called crisis. If we continue to think of it as a technical issue or as something that is surprising or puzzling, and that we need to think about it and bring all the experts around the table and talk about it again and meet again next month and the next year and the year after that, I think that will not lead to any changes. And I think the moment we say, hey, some people are really benefiting from this, they are walking away with a lot of money in their pockets, whereas a different segment of the population is just seeing a really large and growing share of their income to go to rent, as opposed to other basic necessities, as opposed to ensuring them a better quality of life. Let's make this a political problem. It's not a technical problem. There is room for technical expertise, right? If we have this right political vision, and we decide to take this difficult political make the difficult political choices, at some point when we say, okay, how are we going to implement then? By all means, bring the experts into the room and let them hash it out. There are different ways of doing different things, and evidence and data can come and play an important role at that stage. But we're not there yet. We are definitely not seeing the kind of political will or interest or courage to really address the problem. So at this stage, I think it's helpful to name the problem for what it is, and then see if we ever get to the point where we need the actual technical expertise to deliver solutions. But right now it's just a distraction.
And I want to talk a little bit about the title, right, of the book, or at least like the main conceptual component that you're talking about, right? The tenant class, which seems it's a bold statement in this case, I would say, and clearly with the cover that I saw, at least on the advanced reading copy, it's quite bold, and I enjoy it very much. But when we talk, I think still today in society, we tend to use terms like working class, or perhaps the more pejorative low income, when talking about a specific type of people with limited economic means, for example, who are tied to a particular. But obviously with the title, you put more emphasis on what you call a tenant class. And I'm curious why it's important for you to create this distinction, and what we can perhaps advance through this new framing.
My training is in political economy, and my earlier academic work took that Marxian perspective on the issues that I looked at, and the kinds of issues that I was looking at, that concept more clearly applicable and in a sort of traditional Marxian way. With this book, it is true that from a clearly it is true that from a purely scholarly perspective, the term class will not apply to tenants, because class is that fundamental class division happens at the point of production. And there's even a famous essay, a series of essays written by Engels called The Housing Question, where he makes that exact point, that you cannot, that the relationship between tenants and landlords happens at the point of realization and is therefore not a fundamental distinction as the, capitalist and the proletariat, which is at that point of production. But that said, I found the term useful. And I think there is also a tradition with social movements, and perhaps particularly in this global South, to borrow more freely from Marx and Marxist analysis, as long as that supports your ultimate political goals, right? That body of literature is ultimately there to support emancipatory political projects. So if you're borrowing or using it in any way that does that, I think we can get away with it, and we will be ultimately forgiven by the Marxist gods. But that said, I think there's also a theoretical challenge there, because nowadays, if we look at the kind of embeddedness that financial legislation has brought about with housing and production, and also if you take into account that since the original Marxist analysis, we have been much more thoughtful about social reproduction and not only production, that there's quite a few different pieces and beats there that you can pull together and actually pose that more theoretical question of saying, is the tenant and landlord relationship in nowadays as that different from the sort of boss and worker? Can't we make the case that tenants too have no option but pay however much to the tenant, the landlord is asking, because they absolutely need a place to live? Can we make the case that a home is so fundamental for social reproduction that gives those who own it and who have the right to evict people from it a kind of power that is similar to the sort of nearly death sentence that some capitalists had at the time when some of that writing was first conceived? I think there is a theoretical discussion there, and the book doesn't go into it. Again, the goal was to keep it simple and to keep moving. But yes, I think that would be my question. I think my answers, I think I will be forgiven ultimately because of the instrumentality of it, and but I would still argue that there's a conversation there to be had at some point too.
Oh, absolutely, I agree. And even though you don't, as you say, don't go deep necessarily into the theoretical implications of a lot of these things, you still are beholden, or you still clearly pull from a lot of theoretical backing, right? As you mentioned, right, Engels wrote about this in The Housing Question, and you do explicitly pull from Marx, or even later Glenn Coulthard, who's a bit more contemporary in this case, with as an indigenous writer and activist. So I do think these questions are relevant in this case, and you can theorize them in very clear ways while pulling from a whole history of critique of capital, definitely. And actually, I guess we can ask this question now. So you do pull, like I said, from Marx and Coulthard, who Coulthard takes a bit more of a racialized approach to his to his analysis, right? As a Dene writer in his book Red Skin, White Mask. And I'm curious, right, why you feel it's important to expand on their particular analysis. Marx, I can see it more, obviously, as you just mentioned, but why is it important to pull from someone like Glenn Coulthard in as well?
Yes, I think one of the questions that we need to revisit, and then many are already revisiting, is the basic concept of primitive accumulation. So in some Marxian writing, primitive accumulation is described as a sort of as a regional state, as kind of like a little bit of kind of like the genesis of it all. There was some sort of brutal process wherein, you know, people who lived in the land were expelled from it and turned into wage labor, and there, you know, capitalism kind of started, and that's where we pick up and we start trying to understand that. But others, and dating back quite some time, have already argued that, well, not quite, you know. Primitive accumulation continues. Sometimes you can think of like Luxembourg and the notion that it continues in the periphery of in the global south, and you can think about other more contemporary perspectives saying, no, the case of colonialism is also ongoing and we have to deal with it. And so I found important to touch on that one particular kind of stream of critics and of evolving thinking in the Marxian tradition, because I'm talking about housing, and housing is essentially, you know, built on land, and we are in a country with a colonial history, and in my case studies I try to bring a little bit, at least very little, but at least a little bit of that history, to remind myself first and my readers that it goes back a little bit farther, and not only goes back a little bit farther, but those original processes have ongoing consequences. And so that's the one that I picked. I think was essentially because I was talking about land, and I felt the need to kind of go there and not overlook that very important piece.
Yeah. And I think that actually segues quite nicely into the next question that I had in this case. So you do take a bit more of a historical approach at times in your book, which, you know, as you were saying, considering your theoretical interests in this case, I think is logical and worthy. And I'm curious, right, to hear you speak a little bit more about how tenants have been historically exploited, right? So we talk about it in the contemporary setting, but in what way has this, you know, historically happened, and how is it continuously perpetuated to this very day in a way that kind of creates this link between past and?
Mm-hmm. So if you look at the history of Canada, of course, you have that initial stage of that brutal disappropriation of land, and then following that, we essentially import the models of class-based societies in Europe to Canada, and part of that model includes you know, private property, and includes some who can, you know, benefit from the profit and wealth accumulation that derives from private property of land specifically, but also of other capital, and those who don't. And so I think from the very beginning we have that as our model. And then there's more specific cases where you look at Canadian legislation and you see that with very few exceptions, we have always relied on the private sector to provide rental housing. And we have always sort of promoted, not always, but specifically in sort of starting in the middle of the 20th century, really pushed the home ownership, right? So Canada, compared to other countries, we have relatively high rate of home ownership, and we have very little provision of no-market housing. So it has been sort of with a hiatus of perhaps the 1960s, the 1970s, where we produced a lot of no-market housing. Otherwise, that has been our approach. Here's, home ownership, and this is the right path, the good path, and the one everyone should sort of aspire for. And on the other side here, if you didn't make it, we have the private sector here providing rental housing. Good luck with it. We will regulate as little as we can, and just fend for yourselves over there. And when there's a lot of political pressure built up, we might build a little bit of no-market housing for the very, very poor. Will never become, an important part of the rental housing stock. It would be just kind of that, a very small slice and very target to the very poor. That has essentially been the predominant way we do housing in Canada.
But we're painting a little bit of a dire picture, I feel, in this case, insofar as and I do think it's important to criticize, obviously, the policies and the way that society is being conducted here in Canada, and that's valid. But I don't think we can ignore either that people are trying to change certain aspects of Canadian society. And again, this is something that you see in other parts of the world as well. And you focus in particular on tenant organizing in one of the chapters of your book. And I would like you to speak more, if you can, about what tenant organizing is exactly, and what have they achieved or hope to achieve in Canada, both today and historically.
I agree with you. There are a lot of people, I believe, trying to change this. I think there's a lot of people unsatisfied with the way things are, and the way things are the way they have been for a long time. So I believe to also be unsatisfied with the way we set things out. And that's the ultimate goal of the book, is to channel all of that energy, of which I do think there's a lot, a little bit to a different way of thinking, which I argue it might lead to better outcomes. The tenant organizing, what I find fascinating about it is that it kind of cuts through all the noise. And this is where my own professional experience comes into play as a researcher, as someone who participated in a lot of public policy debates. And you sort of stuck a little bit in a particular different framings or different epistemological communities and jargons and ways of thinking it. And when I spend time with tenant organizers, which I do because they're colleagues and friends and neighbors and family, you get this very straightforward analysis saying this person should not be evicted, and this landlord wants to evict this person just to raise rent. Someone who has been paying rent for 10 years and following arrears now by a month or two, maybe because, I don't know, we had a pandemic and the government had to shut down a third of the economy, or some other reason like that, that person should not be evicted. Like, and there's only one way of stopping this, because the landlord can evict that person. The landlord and tenant board will ignore the fact that it was an economic shutdown and the person fell into arrears for no fault of their own. The next place that person will be able to afford, it's not a block over, it's not in the next neighborhood, it's really far away from here, because there are no rent controls. Because in Ontario, for example, the Doug Ford government decided to start destroying rent controls and lifting controls on units built after 2018, for example. And so there's just one way of stopping this from happening, because the institutions at play won't help us. So the only way to make this stop is that we're going to organize every single tenant we can, and anyone else who is willing to join, and we're going to fight the landlord however it takes. We're going to put political pressure. We're going to do what it takes. And that will be the only way to stop this eviction. It's a very clear, for me, and accurate understanding of the situation. And so that's why I find it important to sort of document and share a little bit that take, because it helps us to cut through a lot of the noise that we hear in housing. And then you can think about the sort of outcomes, right? So I think tenant organizing has a lot of immediate successes. Again, every person who doesn't get evicted, every person who finally gets their home, the repairs that their home needs, every person who managed to fight back into an above guideline rent increase that was bogus. All of these things have a really direct impact in the well-being of that particular tenant family, and the morale and sense of power and empowerment that the movement has. And in some cases, we see that it grows into a much bigger political movement. One of the cases the book documents is in BC in the 1960s and 1970s, where a lot of the rent regulations that we have these days was over there is in BC. It was sort of as a response to that movement. The movement had also bigger goals, for example, to gain the right to collective bargaining that workers have, also for tenants. And at that moment it fell short of it, but it gained a lot of other important concessions from the state. If we think about Ontario as well, the rent control legislation that we had here was in response to a lot of political pressure and on the ground organizing by FTMA and others at the time. So I think the movements do both. They act on both fronts. They deal with the immediate problem and they build power. And then in some particular cases, you see that grows to broader and more also long-term political gains against the landlord class.
And there's two things I actually want to say about that that I thought was interesting. First of all, when I was reading your book, I did find it refreshing in a sense to see this perspective, because it kind of flies in the face of this perception that we have in Canada that we're just a very passive country that never really goes up against anything in activism. We tend to think of anti-colonial movements much more across the world, or we are focusing a lot on what's happening in France, rightfully so, currently. And whenever we look at the history of Canada, we say we just kind of do things passively, and once in a while we legislate something. But I think what you're pointing to is very much something that does exist in Canada, right? These movements that aren't always like particularly radical or revolutionary in and of themselves, but do very much help to bring about changes in important ways. And the second thing I want to mention, and if you'll allow me, I'll actually read a section of your book in this case. This is on page 82. So in around the middle of the book, where you say here that the most direct and sure way to contribute to the tenant struggle is to join one of these groups, these tenant organizations, at your building, neighborhood, or city, or start one. Organizing principles, tactics, day-to-day actions, and long-term strategies always vary from tenant group to tenant. These decisions can only be made locally and by the people involved. Still, it is valuable to describe organizing approaches and share examples of disputes won and lost, so tenants everywhere know collective action is not only possible, it's happening now. And I feel like this paragraph in and of itself really gets to the heart of what you were talking about. Also points to an interesting perspective, right, is that yes, you take a Canada-wide approach, right? You were talking about British Columbia and you talk about Saskatchewan or Ontario or Quebec. You really do touch a lot on a lot of different areas of the country. But I do find it's important to realize just how much power people have on a local level as well, right? This is not just a federal issue, right? A lot of these decisions are made at municipal levels or even at borough levels, which I think is an important reminder for people who might be listening or who might be interested in this book. Or in organizing in general, I think it's something that needs reminding, because when we think on a national level or a federal level, it can seem a bit daunting to actually do these changes. And I think that this particular section of your book and what you're talking about is an important reminder. And I just wanted to mention that. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but I just felt it was as good a place as any to to mention that. Okay, so getting into another question here. This is perhaps related to one of the earlier questions that I asked you. So you claim early on in your book that there's this kind of long-standing argument about the housing crisis, right? And that argument goes something along the lines of, well, we just don't have enough supply, right? We don't have enough houses. We don't have enough apartments. And that's why the housing crisis exists. And funny enough, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about the fact that I was going to do this interview, and that same argument came up, right? Almost verbatim. And can you summarize for listeners what this argument perhaps is and why it's perhaps lacking in its analysis of the realities of the tenant?
Absolutely. The supply side argument is the most common explanation provided to the so-called housing crisis. And it is based on a very basic and intuitive supply and demand notion that when there is more supply, prices go down. If there's not enough supply, prices go up. And, tapping into that sort of widely known and intuitive idea, it is then argued that housing is expensive because we don't have enough of it. And therefore, and this is the part that is important, what is the solution for it? We have to build more, lots of more. Okay, how are we going to do that? Well, governments need to get out of the way and reduce all the red tape. Actually, they don't need to completely get out of the way. They need to get out of the way when it comes to regulation and remove the so-called red tape, but they should continue to provide lots of subsidies for the developers to continue to build. So it is clearly a self-serving argument that the pundits of the real estate industry spend quite a bit of energy and resources promoting, and ultimately just brings more and more advantage to them and prevents that other conversation about if it is so costly or so difficult for you to build and add to the supply, how come the business is thriving? How come we are actually building a lot of housing? How come the price never comes down? And please give me some sense of when is enough. What kind of level of supply do we need? How much subsidy is enough for you? What's the ceiling for your profit margin? We don't have these conversations. We just keep saying we need more house, and developers need to build it. And in order to build, we need less regulations and more government subsidies. It's clearly a self-serving argument. I think in the book I refer to Robert Cox, a well-known Canadian political economist who has said theory is always for someone and for some purpose. And I think that is very directly applicable to that argument. Here's the part that is a little bit more complicated. We do need more housing supply. It's not that we don't need. We need, but it's also that there's this very also easy way of explaining and saying additional housing supply is necessary but not sufficient. And it's not any kind of housing that we need, right? So yes, we need to continue to build more, but we need to be very deliberate about where we build, what kind of housing we build, what kind of profit margins we allow, or better even, what share of that new housing will be completely out of the private sector so that it can actually be truly affordable. So I know a lot of serious and progressive advocates who are there and who are saying we need to build more, and so that's what sometimes it gets a little bit complicated, because sometimes that argument inadvertently supports that other argument, right? So it's complicated, but I think it's also the notion that it's sufficient, it's necessary, but not sufficient, and it's not just any housing. I think it's enough to as a comeback to the supply argument, and sometimes to be a bit more facetious, when the conversation gets heated, and the folks saying like governments just need to provide more incentives to developers. It's like, well, it's exactly what we've been doing for 30 years, and let me know how it's working out for us. I mean, actually, let me know how it's working out for the rest of us, because I know how it is working for the development industry.
Absolutely. And as I was reading your book and listening to your answer just now, it's like, yeah, just spend about 5 minutes walking around in Montreal, and yeah, you'll see that there's condos being built everywhere, right? It's a very common thing. Most of the development that's happening is condos, but they're also $2,500 a month or whatever, so that's completely unreasonable to most people, right? It's a perspective on it that's investment based rather than living based, which is problematic, and to say the least. But again, there's not all is lost, so to speak, right? So you were talking about tenant organizing that does help with this, but you also mentioned this in a previous answer, that there is something that we call non-market housing, right? And you alluded to this in a sense, and it's something that you bring up in the book. And I'm curious to hear you speak a little bit more about what perhaps are the benefits and drawbacks of non-market housing in compared to what is much more common, right, in Canada, which is private market rental. And yeah, what are some of the challenges basically that we're facing as Canadians seeking non-market housing?
Yes, Canada has chosen to allow the private sector. If I may restart, Canada has chosen to rely on the private sector for rental housing. A few decades ago, we had decided that that was not a good idea when it came to public health. That was not a good idea when it came to education. It was not a good idea to rely entirely on the private sector when it came to transit. And there are even other examples. We also decided that governments have to actively regulate or own utility companies and have to control prices, because people need heating in the winter, people need water, people need sewage and other infrastructure that is fundamental for our living. And yet, with private rental housing, we decided that we need to intervene a lot less. Other countries have made different choices and have created a much larger supply of non-market housing. And that has two direct outcomes. The first is obviously for those who live in non-market housing, rents are cheaper for the obvious reason that there's no profit making. Sometimes people get a little bit confused by the fact that non-market housing, when first comes to market, when it's first built, is not that much cheaper. But analysis shows that over time, it becomes much cheaper in comparison to private rentals. And that is because there's a cost of land, there's a cost of building, and there's a cost of maintenance that you sort of can avoid. But if you are committed to not profiting from those units and simply providing that at cost over the long term, it is significantly cheaper. The other outcome of that, of having a larger share of your total rental stock being non-for-profit, is that it holds back a little bit that other segment, the for-profit segment, right? If people start having choice, and if if going to a non-profit housing provider, it's an alternative, then the private sector has to adapt a little bit its own expectations for how the market work and how much it can profit and essentially how much it can hike rents up. So you create a little bit more of that dynamic of less private sector monopoly and more alternatives for tenants, and that is a very viable thing to do. It's essentially not really radical at all, and we have both examples of certain countries where that share is higher, and we have examples of very good nonprofit providers in Canada. It's not to the scale that we need, but the scaling up is definitely possible. And just kind of like one clarification for folks who don't spend the entire days looking at this as I do. When we talk about non-market housing, there's a bunch of things inside of the big bucket, right? It can be what sometimes is referred as social housing, which usually refers to housing that the government owns and manage. It is also includes co-ops, which are one type of non-market housing, includes non-for-profits. So sometimes there are small organizations that own just one building, and then also includes large non-profit housing providers. Sometimes they have a much larger portfolio, and then they do some cross-subsidization, which means that perhaps some tenants pay close to the market price, but others get a much cheaper rent that it's more adjusted to their income. So there are various models, and there's a discussion to be had. Our experience is what's best, which one works better, what are things that kind of didn't work and we need to avoid doing in the future. There's obviously that technical discussion, but overall is this notion that we will take profit out of the equation, same as we did with health, same as we did with education, same as we partially did with transit and other spheres of services that we just think are too important for us to allow profit to come before people.
I think this discussion of non-market housing versus for-profit housing and so on does get to the heart of the other aspects. So we've been focusing a lot on tenants, right? But a big part of the discussion also focuses on landlords as, and a lot of the discussion about it also often includes, well, they're investing, they're putting up the risk, so to speak, and they're taking care of actually the proper functioning of the building that they own and so on. And I'm curious, right? Can you speak a little bit more as to how landlords are talked about in the media or in society at large, and why perhaps this idea is important to break, right? The idea of how landlords are perhaps portrayed, why it's important to kind of break in order to move past some of the problems we have in society.
So my background in public policy that focuses in Canada is on poverty reduction work. So it means that I spend a lot of time looking at the different incomes and outcome and expenditure of low and moderate income households. So the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden we shut down large segments of the economy, especially low-wage jobs that got hit first and the most. And then in a meeting, one of my first Zoom calls with my colleagues at the Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives, and we were thinking about what kind of research do we need to do, how can we contribute, where do we jump in, and And the only thing that would come to my mind is like, people won't be able to pay rent. There's just not enough money in their bank accounts if they can't go to work. And this was before the creation of SURB, right? And I had also written about the limitations of employment insurance and how a lot of people can actually access that benefit. So I'm someone who has like this inside view of what the finances of this segment of the population looks like. I also know that employment insurance is not always accessible, and we just got news that all of these people are being sent home without pay, and I was just like, they can't pay rent. They can't pay rent. They're going to fall into years. They're going to be evicted. There's going to be some massive evictions, and we sort of have to talk about it. So I wrote this research report over a weekend. Actually, it was this frantic 48 hours of working, and my communication team jumped in and did the design, and essentially shows that what I'm saying, like without employment income, there is an estimated between 40 and 60% of working tenant households won't be able to make rent for more than a month, 2, 3 max. And the report got a lot of media coverage. And I started doing interviews, and it's including CBC syndications across the country. And when I presented those facts, and I concluded by saying, we need some sort of rent forgiveness. We need some sort of rent freeze. The government needs to jump in and prevent a tsunami of evictions. The most common reaction I got was, but how about the landlord? And it was puzzling to me. I was like, seriously? Like at this moment, that's what we're going to think about? What about the people who own property and won't have a month's worth of rent for a month or two? Is that the people who we're going to really focus on, where the global economy is going to shreds? And so that, that led me to more and more discussions about it, and just start paying more attention on how landlords are commonly characterized in day-to-day conversations, but also often in the media. And that's where later I also published a short analysis that was titled "Struggling Landlords is Not Your Typical Landlord," right? So I go after this notion that landlords are a family or an individual that is somewhat financially insecure, has a big mortgage, and without the rent income, they can't make ends meet. I include the caveat that there's a very small share of landlords that do fall into that category, but by no way should that be the sort of overall characterization or common view of landlords. That is awfully inaccurate, and within the past few years it has become even more inaccurate, as we have real estate investment trusts and the corporate landlords growing and buying up property and so on and so forth. And even the individual investors, when you say, but we just have one second home, yes, great, treat it as a business and act like a business person. And that means, paying taxes. That means accepting regulations. That means accepting risk. That means stop whining about, the fact that the people who are paying rent has some expectations about, the toilet working and the ceiling not be fallen and things like that. So yes, I go strong on that one, and I got a lot of pushback, as you can imagine. But it's good conversation.
Absolutely. And yeah, that whole thing, well, I have to pay for a second home. The fact that you have a second home is already just mind-boggling. So it's just like, what?
And it's a lot. It's a lot. There's about some estimates that in some parts of the country, about a third of the rental housing stock, it's owned by multiple property owners. So people who own their homes and a few additional homes. So even going back to that supply question, if you really think the problem is supply, and shouldn't we be thinking about the people who have 3, 4, 5 houses? And how about they, push some that supply back so others can own too, if that is, you're accepting that as, for the moment, as your desired policy outcome, right? So yes, so I push quite a bit on this fantasized notion that landlords are folks struggling financially, and that their financial well-being should be equated with that of low and moderate income tenants who pay rent every single month and sometimes may fall into arrears.
Absolutely. And to bring it back to the earlier conversation that we had, right, when you were justifying, right, why equated tenant class with some of the wider issues of that we're facing under capitalism, for example, I feel like this again fits right into the type of discussion that you hear about, say, someone like Jeff Bezos, I don't know, who makes $1 billion a second. I mean, obviously exaggerating, but this idea that, well, it's something that they deserve because they put the effort into it, right? And I feel it's not exactly the same thing that you're talking about in this case, but you do see a similar type of rhetoric that is provided, right? Where the idea that there's a certain kind of quote unquote risk put into certain forms of investment, and that deserves that some people make 200, 300, 400 times more or have a second or third home than the average person, right? Which I don't think ever justifiable personally. Maybe my own, again, maybe I'll get some pushback for that, but I don't think personally you can ever justify that. But hey, that's just me. But I think kind of coming down or winding up in this case, winding down. We've talked a lot about the issues and possible this case, and you do emphasize both throughout this interview and in your book, right, that there is some stuff to be done, right, both on the policy side and by the general population or by housing. So can you sum up for listeners what you think is to be done, right? How can we actually go forward in this case in a productive way that doesn't just mean tearing everything down and starting up again, because that's not necessarily a productive way to look at things. Exactly. So how can we move forward in a constructive and productive way, in a way that hopefully satisfies as many people as possible?
I believe the first step, or one of the first steps, is to have a serious political debate about this, to stop pretending that we're trying to solve a technical puzzle and to just openly say, okay, what's our take on housing? Is it okay that some will use housing as an asset and they're going to flip it back and forward and do all sorts of financial tricks just to, keep increasing their returns on that asset? Or that's not okay, because housing is something that is very important and people's lives depending on having access to it. What's the role of the state? Is the government going to continue just to ensuring that the private sector has it the way it wants and is able to continue to drive profits high and benefit from the current market setup? Or is the government just going to say, no, you can't? No, you can't. Sorry, housing is too important, is a basic necessity, and we will intervene here and we will cut your profit margins. And if the profit margins are not good enough for you, I'm sorry, you're going to have to choose another line of work where you can just go to town, but not with housing. Sorry, not with housing. You can do it with health, you can do it with education, you can do it in a number of other sectors that we decided as societies collective goals are more important than profit, or we're just not going to do that. So I think that's the ultimate sort of political projects that have to be put on the table as a serious discussion, and then then we have other conversations after that, and we also need to stop pretending that everyone is equally impacted by this. It's not true. Some people who bought homes, even if they pay their mortgage and the mortgages consume a large part of their income, ultimately they are amassing wealth and benefiting from this sort of financial setup that we have right now. And I'm not saying they did it on purpose. I'm not saying there's any sort of fault in what they did, but it's still the outcome is that they're getting windfall gains, which is the term that we use to mean that they're they're making a lot of gains due to reasons that are completely unrelated with anything they have done or anything they have contributed to. So I think these conversations are really important, and on a more sort of moving towards like a more kind of practical and concrete observations, is that the book wraps up on asking folks to take a side. So stop pretending that it impacts all of us, and stop pretending that some are not gaining a lot from this, and pick a side. What's going to be our side on the housing question, regardless of what you do, regardless if you're a tenant, a homeowner, a business owner, if you work in policy research, or if you're actually a tenant organizer or a tenant. And I think those already, as I mentioned before, they already have picked up they know what their side is. They have picked their side a long time ago, and they're working on it. But pick a side and be honest about what do you think should be the ultimate outcome, and let's stop pretending.
Absolutely. Very, I agree. I don't know what to say to that, except yes, I agree. As we wrap up, can you share for us perhaps what your preferred part of the book is? I always like to end conversations on that, and if you want to read a section specifically, that's a perfect time to do so.
Chapter 4 of the book, it starts by making an argument of the importance of history and the different histories we can tell about a country or a people. And it's where I make the argument, to go back to your one earlier point, that we actually have a history of working class and tenant struggle in Canada. It has been part what people do. It has been part of people were compelled to do to protect themselves and their families and their communities. It's just that it gets a lot less attention in the way we tell that story about Canada and what Canada is. And I start, going back a little bit to my first country, in Brazil, and my experience in that kind of tumultuous 1980s, and how I became passionate about history because I was just kind of trying to understand the kind of messy world around me. And I learned one particular version of that history growing up in this sort of context in which I was growing up, and later in life, as I started to study more the history of Brazil and the history of social movements in particular, a lot of the original history that I learned was challenging. I learned a very different narrative about processes in Brazil in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and then I brought that lesson with me as I came to Canada, and I was always kind of a bit suspicious of the official narrative, and then through this work I sort of bring a little bit out the other stories, the other narratives, which is essentially the topic of that chapter 4, that focus on on past on accounts of tenant organizing in the past. So yeah, that session is dear to me because I'm a nerd when it comes to history, and because also sort of allowed me to connect a little bit my two worlds and my two experiences as someone who grew up in Brazil and immigrated to Canada.
Well, thank you very much for this. And the last question I would have for you. What didn't I ask in this interview? And do you have an answer to that hypothetical?
I'm gonna have to think about that for a second.
Yeah, of course.
I found interesting that you didn't ask me about policy solution. And obviously you read the book very closely, and you didn't go in that direction. And that is one of the most common questions that I get when I mention and publish this book on housing. And almost always the follow-up question is like, what solutions are you proposing? And I was like, I'm not proposing policy solutions. Speaking about perhaps a political response that I think should be considered for this situation. But I always find intriguing that it not only within the sort of research and public policy circles, but even more broadly, we seem to be a little bit hardwired at this point to think about policy solutions rather than go for the sort of political response. And or speaking about like what should people do so the government can do the right thing, right? Or it's that kind of reaction. It's less common, and so yeah.
Well, thank you for that answer, and thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today about your new book. Do you know when it's coming out exactly?
First, thank you for having me. This has been a very fun and pleasant interview, and I feel a little bit spoiled to have the opportunity to talk so much about this piece of work and other things that I've been doing. The book's actually already out. It was the official publication date was May 2nd, but it's already been shipped to everyone who have pre-orders, and it's with Between the Lines.
Fantastic. We'll make sure to include a link to it in the description of the show so people can get a copy. And is there anywhere that people can get into contact with you if they have any questions or further comments?
Yes, absolutely. I'm always happy to continue the conversation and to have sidebar conversations with readers and folks who are interested on this topic. The best way to find me is through the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives website. You have my email there, and you have some other contact information that will allow you to connect directly.
Fantastic. Well, again, Ricardo, thank you very much for your time, and I hope all the best for this project and future projects.
Thank you. And again, thank you for, like, when I read your question, I was like, wow, you read it very closely, the book, and your questions even more so. And I always feel flattered. There's so much good stuff to read out there. Whenever people spend time reading my stuff, I always feel a little bit flattered.
I know. It's one of the only advantages of having an English degree is that you can actually close read and create or like read quickly some things and get productive questions out of it.
Okay, great. This has been awesome.